She did not mean to read the letter. That was the truth she would carry with her long after the ink had dried, long after the candles had burned to their very roots, long after the name written upon that cream-colored parchment had changed the entire course of her life. She did not mean to read it, but she did. And nothing, not the propriety she had been raised upon, not the quiet obedience her mother had stitched into her very bones, nothing could ever make her unread it. The letter had been addressed to her sister. Miss Emmeline Ashworth had always been the invisible daughter, the second one, the one whose hair was not quite golden enough, whose eyes were not quite blue enough, whose laugh was a half measure too loud in polite company. She was 23 years of age, and already the drawing-rooms of Bath whispered that she was perhaps too bookish, too stubborn, too entirely unsuited to the business of being agreeable. She did not disagree. She had, in fact, accepted her invisibility the way one accepts a persistent draught in a poorly insulated hall, with resignation and the occasional shiver. Her elder sister, Miss Arabella Ashworth, was everything Emmeline was not. Arabella was golden-haired and gentle-voiced, and possessed of a smile that made clergymen forget their sermons. She was, in every conceivable way, the daughter their mother had always intended to possess. And it was Arabella who had been promised, through a quiet but binding arrangement, conducted over brandy between two aging men with gout and ambition, to the Duke of Ravenscroft. His Grace, Aldrich Cavendish, the 5th Duke of Ravenscroft. Even the name sounded like a door closing in winter. Emmeline had heard the stories, as all of Bath had heard them. The Duke was said to be cold, not merely reserved, not simply aristocratic in his restraint, but genuinely architecturally cold, as though warmth had been deliberately designed out of him, the way one might design a house without windows to keep out the noise of the world. He was 31 years of age, and had never once been observed to smile in public. He had buried a father who despised him, managed an estate of 40,000 acres, and apparently conducted his affairs, including the matter of acquiring a wife, with the same detached efficiency one might apply to the purchase of good horseflesh. He had written to Arabella, or rather his solicitor had written on his behalf, outlining the terms of the arrangement with all the romance of a quarterly account ledger. Emmeline had only picked up the letter because it had fallen from the escritoire in her sister's bedchamber, and she had only begun to read it because she was Emmeline Ashworth, and she had never once in her life been able to leave a piece of paper unread. It was in the 4th paragraph that she saw it. The Duchess is expected to arrive at Ravenscroft no later than the 15th of November, prepared to fulfill her obligations with grace and without complaint. His Grace requires a woman of composure, not sentiment. He has had quite enough of sentiment. Composure, not sentiment, as though Arabella were a piece of furniture being delivered to specification, as though the word bride were interchangeable with any number of synonyms, all of them equally impersonal. Emmeline set the letter down very carefully, and then she picked it up again, because it was then, in the silence of her sister's rose-scented room, with the autumn rain tapping at the window-panes like an insistent, uninvited guest, that she read the postscript, the single line that the solicitor had added, perhaps carelessly, perhaps not. His Grace specifically notes that should Miss Ashworth find herself unwilling or unable to fulfill this arrangement, there is no legal impediment to the substitution of another eligible female of the same family, provided she meets the basic requirements of age, respectability, and reasonable health. Emmeline read the line twice, then a third time. She sat down upon her sister's bed, the letter in her hands, and she thought about Arabella, who had wept for 3 days running when the arrangement was announced, who had confessed in whispers that she had already given her heart, quietly and irretrievably, to a young curate in Wiltshire, who had nothing to his name but kindness and a collection of rather good sermons. She thought about her mother, whose nerves were said to be in a perpetual state of agitation, and who would not survive the scandal of a broken betrothal. She thought about herself, and about the draught in the hall, and about the particular loneliness of being the daughter no one had written a letter for. And then, God help her, she began to form a plan.
The journey to Ravenscroft Manor took 2 days by carriage, through countryside that grew progressively wilder and more austere as they pressed north. The hills were the colour of old pewter. The trees had lost their leaves entirely, and they stood along the roadside like an honour guard of skeletons, bare-armed and impassive, watching the carriage pass with the hollow indifference of things that have seen too many winters to be impressed by one more traveller. Emmeline sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her heart hammering so loudly she was privately certain her maid, Dotty, could hear it from across the carriage. She had told her mother that Arabella had developed a fever and was unable to travel, and that she, Emmeline, responsible, invisible, entirely unsentimental Emmeline, had offered to go in her place to explain the situation to the Duke in person and arrange an extension of the timeline. Her mother had accepted this explanation with the particular credulity of a woman who wanted very badly to believe in the smoothness of things. She had not precisely told her mother the whole truth, but then she had not precisely told herself the whole truth either. She told herself she was going to negotiate. She told herself she was going to advocate for her sister's happiness, present the situation logically, appeal to the Duke's reason. She told herself all of this very firmly, in the same determined voice she used when she was trying to convince herself that a thunderstorm was not frightening. She did not tell herself what the other possibility was, not yet. Ravenscroft Manor emerged from the fog of the November morning like something conjured by a particularly grim imagination. It was enormous, that was the first thing. Not merely large, but vast in the manner of buildings that have been added to by successive generations, each one apparently more determined than the last to assert their ambition in stone. The towers were medieval, the east wing was Georgian. The gardens, visible in their dormant winter state, were the formal, symmetrical kind that suggested a mind that disliked surprises. Emmeline stepped from the carriage onto gravel that crunched beneath the boots like the breaking of small promises. The butler who received her was a man of extraordinary impassivity. He had the face of someone who had trained himself, over decades of service, to register absolutely nothing, and he had achieved this so completely that Emmeline briefly wondered whether he was, in fact, a very well-constructed automaton. "In Miss Ashworth," he intoned. "His Grace is expecting you in the library." The library. She followed him through corridors that smelled of beeswax and old wood, and the particular dampness of a house too large to be entirely warm. The floors were marble in the entrance hall, then dark oak as they pressed deeper into the house. Portraits watched her from the walls, generations of Cavendish men, all with the same strong jaw, the same dark eyes, the same expression suggesting they found the world faintly disappointing. The library door was mahogany, and it was very tall, and the butler opened it with the gravity of a man admitting someone to an audience with royalty, which Emmeline supposed was not entirely inaccurate. He was standing at the window. His back was to her. She had imagined, in the 2 days of the carriage journey, in the quiet, desperate hours of the night, that she had prepared herself for the Duke of Ravenscroft. She had constructed him in her mind from the raw materials of rumour and reputation, cold, autocratic, architectural in his indifference. She had armoured herself accordingly. She had not precisely prepared herself for his shoulders. This was, she acknowledged privately, an absurd thing to notice, and yet there it was. He was tall, taller than she had supposed, and the shoulders of his charcoal coat described a certain breadth that suggested a man who did not merely occupy space, but commanded it, the way weather commanded the sky.
His dark hair was slightly overlong, curling just at the collar in a way that was either artful or entirely unconsidered, and she could not yet determine which. He turned. His face was, well, it was the jaw first. That was the Cavendish jaw from the portraits, all right. Strong and uncompromising, and designed apparently to communicate resolve. His eyes were very dark, the grey-green of deep water, and they assessed her with a swift, complete, and unsentimental attention that made her feel as though she had been read like a balance sheet, and the numbers were not entirely in her favour. There was a silence. It lasted, Emmeline estimated, approximately 7 years. "You," said the Duke of Ravenscroft, in a voice that was low and deliberate and entirely without warmth, "you are not Arabella Ashworth." It was not a question. Emmeline lifted her chin. She was in this moment grateful for every single lecture her mother had ever delivered on the subject of composure, because it was composure, and composure alone, that kept her voice from trembling as she replied. "No," she said, "I am not. I am Miss Emmeline Ashworth, the second daughter." Another silence. He did not move, did not blink with any particular frequency, simply looked at her with those deep water eyes, and waited with the patience of a man who has learned that waiting often extracts more information than questions. "And you have come," he said at last, "in your sister's place." "I have come," Emmeline said carefully, "to explain my sister's situation. She is unable to fulfill the arrangement, Your Grace, through no fault of her character. She is a good woman. She is simply, her affections are engaged elsewhere, and I did not think it right that you should receive a wife whose heart was already bestowed upon another man, however binding the arrangement might be on paper." Something shifted in his expression. It was very small, that shift, barely perceptible, but she caught it, a tightening around the eyes. Not anger precisely, something more complicated than anger, something that looked for just a flicker of an instant, almost like recognition. "How very noble," he said, and the words were not warm, but they were not quite contemptuous. "And so you have come in person to inform me that I have been, in effect, stood at the altar." "You are not yet at the altar, Your Grace." A technicality, a significant one, I should think. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he moved, away from the window, towards the great fireplace where a fire burned with the cheerful industry of something that had not been informed of the general atmosphere of the room, and he said, without looking at her, "Sit down, Miss Ashworth." She sat. He did not. He stood with one hand on the mantelpiece, looking into the fire, and the light of it moved across the planes of his face and made him look for a moment less like a portrait and more like a tired man, a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time and simply grown accustomed to the weight of it. There was a postscript, Emmeline said, because she was Emmeline Ashworth, and she had never in her life been particularly gifted at strategic silence. He turned to look at her. "In the solicitor's letter," she continued, it noted that there was no legal impediment to a substitution if the primary party was unwilling or unable." The silence that followed this statement was of an entirely different quality to the ones that had preceded it. This one had texture, weight. The firelight crackled. Somewhere in the vast, cold distances of the house, a clock struck the half-hour. "The Duke," said the Duke, "you read my solicitor's letter." "It fell," said Emmeline, "and I am constitutionally incapable of leaving a piece of paper unread. I am aware this is a character deficiency." Something extraordinary happened then, something Emmeline would later replay in her memory with the careful repeated attention of a scholar examining a newly discovered manuscript. The corner of his mouth, just the left corner, just fractionally, moved. It was not perhaps a smile, it was the ghost of the architectural drawing of a smile, but it was something. "You are very forthright," he said, "for a woman attempting to negotiate a marriage." "I am not negotiating a marriage," Emmeline said, with slightly more conviction than she felt.
I am explaining a situation. What you choose to do with the explanation is entirely your own affair. And yet, he said, you are here, in my library, having read my private correspondence and travelled 2 days north in November, alone, I presume, except for a maid. Dotty, Emmeline confirmed. She is very reliable. Miss Ashworth, he said her name as though he were testing the weight of it. What precisely is it that you want? The question fell into the room like a stone into deep water, and Emmeline felt the ripples of it move through her chest. What did she want? She had been so very busy constructing arguments, rehearsing logic, preparing the rational scaffolding of her case, that the question itself, so simple, so devastatingly direct, arrived like an unexpected cold draught. She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she made the decision she had been not quite making for 2 days and 2 nights, and all the dark, honest hours in between. I want, she said, with the steadiness of a woman stepping off a very high ledge, to propose an alternative arrangement, if you will hear it. He heard it. She told him everything, about Arabella and the curate in Wiltshire, about her mother's nerves, about the particular mathematics of her own situation, 23 years of age, no fortune of her own, no obvious prospects, and, she said this last part with the dry precision of a woman who has made her peace with a difficult truth, I am not romantic, she told him, and she believed it when she said it. I do not expect ardour. I do not require poetry. Your solicitor's letter specified composure and the absence of sentiment, and I flatter myself that I possess at least the former in adequate quantity. I am well read. I am capable of managing a household. I will not embarrass you in company, and I will not make demands upon your person or your affections that you are not prepared to meet. She folded her hands in her lap when she had finished, and looked at him with the expression of a woman waiting for a verdict at which she has already made her peace. He was looking at her very strangely. "You are the most peculiar woman I have ever had occasion to meet," he said slowly. "So I have been told," Emmeline said. "It has not previously been offered as a compliment." "I did not offer it as one," he said, and then, after a pause that stretched itself thin as gold wire, "nor did I offer it as a condemnation." She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire spoke in quiet, urgent crackling, as though it were trying to communicate something that neither of them had yet found the vocabulary for. "I will need time," he said at last.
"Of course, you will stay, as a guest, for a fortnight. There are matters I must consider. I understand." He understood, he repeated, and there was something in his voice then that she could not entirely decipher, something that was not quite wonder, but was in the same neighborhood. He moved back toward the window, and the gray November light fell across him, and she saw, in that light, that the lines around his eyes were not merely the lines of sternness, as she had first supposed, but also of something older, something more private. She thought of his solicitor's letter. He has had quite enough of sentiment. And she wondered, for the first time, but not the last, what it was that had made him so. The fortnight that followed was unlike anything Emmeline had imagined. She had expected coldness, not cruelty perhaps, but the kind of pointed indifference that would leave her in no doubt as to her marginal position in this vast grey house. She had packed her resignation the way one packs an umbrella in November, not expecting to need it, but certain that one will. Instead, she found a library. She found it on the second morning, following a corridor she had not previously explored, and she stood in the doorway of it for a full minute before she stepped inside, because it was extraordinary. 3 walls of books, from floor to an almost impossible ceiling, reached by a wrought-iron gallery with a rolling ladder that moved on brass rails with a smoothness suggesting it was very frequently used. There were 8 armchairs. There were 2 reading desks. There was, in the corner, a telescope pointing toward a window that faced north, toward the dark hills. She was there for 3 hours before she heard the door. He came in without announcement, without particular ceremony, as a man enters a room that is fundamentally his own. He stopped when he saw her, seated in the chair nearest the fire, with a volume of philosophical transactions open on her lap, and her hair, she was not expecting company, rather loosely pinned. "You found it," he said. "I did not mean to intrude," she said quickly, beginning to rise. "Sit down," he said, for the second time, and then, after a pause, "Please." That single word, "please," changed the temperature of the room by some small but unmistakable degree. He took the chair across from her, on the other side of the fire, and he opened his own book. She could not see the spine, and for a time they simply read, in silence, two people in a library, on opposite sides of a fire, in a house full of cold draughts and old stone, reading. And Emmeline thought that she had spent 23 years in drawing-rooms and music-rooms and morning-rooms, and never once felt as entirely, inexplicably at ease as she did in this moment, in this library that smelled of old leather and wood-smoke, with this unsmiling, impossible man reading quietly across the fire from her. At length he said, without looking up, "What are you reading?" "The Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, 1763. There is a rather compelling paper on the mathematical properties of elliptical orbits." He looked up then, those deep-water eyes lit by firelight. "You are reading mathematics," he said. "I find it soothing," she said. Another of those almost not smiles. It was longer this time. She was beginning to collect them, these fractional expressions, the way one collects pressed flowers, carefully, with an awareness of their fragility. "I owe you something," he said, after a time. She looked at him. "Your Grace?" "An explanation of the letter, of the manner in which it was written." He looked down at his book, though he was not reading it. "I did not intend for it to be what it was. My solicitor is efficient. He translated my requirements in a language that was perhaps excessively transactional." He paused. "I am aware that it was not a kind letter." "No," Emmeline said, quietly. "It was not." "I have not been," he said, "a particularly kind man for some years." He turned a page he was not reading. "There were reasons for this. They are not reasons I wish to enumerate at present, but I want you to understand that the coldness you may have observed is not all that I am." Emmeline set her philosophical transactions very carefully on the arm of the chair. She looked at him, at the strong jaw and the tired eyes, and the slightly overlong dark hair, and the shoulders that had surprised her, and she thought, "Here is a man who has closed every window in himself to keep out a particular cold, and does not entirely remember any longer how to let the light back in." "I know," she said softly. "I rather thought I did." The fortnight passed and passed and passed. They walked the dormant gardens, she and the Duke, on mornings when the frost had silvered every surface, and their breath made small transient clouds in the cold air. He told her about the estate, about the tenants in the southern farms, about the drainage works he was supervising in the eastern fields, about the 340-year-old oak tree in the park that had survived every storm since the reign of Henry VIII, and that he visited, he admitted, with something approaching private affection. She told him about mathematics, about the particular satisfaction of a problem whose solution required not cleverness alone, but patience, about her father, who had been a quiet, bookish man, and who had read to her from encyclopedias at bedtime, and who had died when she was 12, and left behind him a silence in the house that no amount of her mother's nervous chatter had ever quite filled. They did not speak in those early days of the arrangement, of the proposals she had made in the library on that first afternoon. It hung between them like a question neither of them wished to press, for fear of spoiling whatever this was, this careful, fire-lit, frost-edged thing that was growing with the quiet determination of something that has decided to grow, whether or not it has been given permission. It was on the 11th day that the letter came from her mother. Emmeline read it in her room, standing by the window with the November light falling grey and thin across the page, and her heart sank by slow degrees, the way a ship sinks, reluctant, incremental, and then all at once. Her mother had discovered the truth. The curate in Wiltshire had, apparently, written to Arabella in terms that had made their way via the dressmaker to the rector's wife, and thence to half of Bath. The substitution, her mother wrote, in handwriting increasingly agitated, was the only resolution. If Emmeline did not secure the arrangement, the family was ruined. Arabella's reputation was in tatters. Her mother's nerves would not survive it. The language grew increasingly operatic toward the end, but the essential message was clear. Come home engaged, or do not come home at all. She folded the letter. She stood at the window for a long time, watching the last of the autumn leaves skitter across the gravel below, driven by a wind that did not know or care what it disrupted. And then she went to find him.
He was in the library, of course he was. He looked up when she entered, and whatever he saw in her face made him set his book down immediately, without marking his page. "What has happened?" he said. She told him. All of it this time, the complete truth held back for nothing, because she was done with the careful architecture of partial disclosures, done with the self-protecting half-story. She told him about her mother's letter, about the social catastrophe unfolding in Bath, about the pressure that had been applied to her from the beginning, and she told him, and this was the hardest part, the part that cost her the most, that she was aware the situation left him no real choice, and that she was sorry for it. "I did not come here to trap you," she said. Her voice was steady, though it required considerable structural support to remain so. "I came here because I wanted to help my sister, and I have been less than entirely honest with myself about my other motivations, and I think you deserve to know that." "And what," he said very quietly, "are your other motivations?" She looked at the fire, at the familiar crackling, the faithful light. "I wanted," she said, "to matter, to be the person someone had written a letter for, not the second daughter, not the invisible one." She paused. "That was vain of me, and perhaps foolish, and I am sorry if it has placed you in an impossible position." Silence, longer than any silence before it. And then he said her name. Not Miss Ainsworth, not her title, not her station, not the formal two-syllable distance that propriety required. He said her given name, Emmeline, and it landed in the room with the weight of something that has been decided. She looked at him. He had risen. He was standing very close, closer than propriety strictly advised, close enough that she could see very clearly that the corner of his mouth was not merely considering a smile, but had, in fact, committed to one, a full one. Small, yes, and restrained as everything about him was restrained, but real, genuinely, unmistakably real. "You are not the bride I ordered," he said. And his voice, that low, deliberate voice, held something it had not held before, warmth, actual, architectural, irrevocable warmth. "No," she said, "I know that." "You are—" He paused, as though choosing his next words with the care of a man who has learned that words once given cannot be recovered. "Considerably more than that. And I find that I am grateful that the letter fell." She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire burned. "I have not—" he began and stopped, and began again with the quiet determination of a man unlatching a door he has kept closed for a very long time. "I have not permitted myself to want things for some years. It seemed safer not to want, not to hope." He looked at her steadily. "I find, against my better judgment and most of my prior convictions, that I want things again. I I would like to know what it would be to wake in a house where someone reads mathematics by the fire and argues with me about the properties of elliptical orbits."
Emmeline's heart was doing something extremely unregulated. "That is," she said with great effort, "a remarkably indirect proposal, Your Grace." "I am aware," he said. "I am working up to the direct version." She waited. "Emmeline Ashworth," he said, "second daughter, reader of philosophical transactions, interceptor of private correspondence, the most peculiar, most forthright, most unexpectedly necessary woman I have ever had the profound inconvenience of meeting." The warmth in his voice had deepened into something richer, something that filled the cold library the way good firelight fills a room. "Will you do me the considerable honor of becoming my wife? Not because of arrangements made between old men with gout and ambition, not because your mother's nerves require it, but because I am asking you specifically, and because I would very much like you to say yes." The room was very quiet. The fire crackled its small, faithful commentary. Emmeline looked at this man, this closed, careful, lonely, complicated, almost smiling man, and she thought of all the drawing-rooms she had sat in, invisible, waiting for a story to happen to her. And she thought, perhaps this is how they begin, not with a letter written to someone else, not with a perfect match arrived at by perfect calculation, but with a letter that falls from a desk in a sister's rose-scented room, and a carriage journey through skeleton trees, and a library that smells of wood smoke and old leather, and two people who are perhaps between them precisely peculiar enough to make something real. "Yes," she said, "I will. I rather think I will." They were married on the 22nd of December, when the frost lay thick on the stone walls of Ravenscroft, and the great oak in the park stood silver and ancient against a pale winter sky. It was not a large wedding, it was not a fashionable one. Bath had opinions about it, as Bath had opinions about everything, and those opinions were aired at length in drawing-rooms across the county. Emmeline did not particularly mind. She was in the library. He came to find her there in the last hour of their wedding day, as the candles burned low and the fire spoke quietly to itself, and he brought with him a glass of wine and a look in his deep-water eyes that was entirely, irrevocably, unarchitecturally warm. He sat down across from her. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Happy?" he said. It was a small word, a single, unguarded syllable, asked without armor, without distance, without any of the elaborate protective architecture of a man who had spent years not wanting things. Emmeline Ashworth, who had been the second daughter, the invisible one, the girl whose laugh was half a measure too loud in polite company, smiled at him across the firelight. "Exceedingly," she said. Outside, the first snow of winter had begun to fall on Ravenscroft, quiet, impartial, covering everything in the same white impartiality. But inside the library, the fire burned warm and steady, and two people sat across from one another, reading in the comfortable and entirely miraculous silence of those who have at last found the person they were always meant to disturb. This has been I'm Not the Bride You Ordered, an original story from the Duke's Lost Letters. If this story found you tonight, leave your thoughts below and subscribe so the next letter finds you too.